Welcome to the Lorecast, where we look into the lore and the stories by which we live. I'm Dr. Craig Chalquist, and you can find us at chalquist.com/podcast and at a number of other online venues. In a previous podcast, not too long ago, I talked about what I see as the limits of the therapy paradigm, the therapy way of looking at people and the world and the job itself. Like any profession, psychotherapy has its blind spots, and I mentioned a few of them. So I thought that this podcast was going to be a continuation of that, but it ended up going in a slightly different direction. So it both is and isn't. We'll have to see how. What I want to put in the foreground is not more limitations of the therapy paradigm. That's what I was going to do originally. I'd like to talk instead about some limits and shadows of the emphasis on healing and wholeness. Because I think we can get in trouble with these just as we can with anything. And I see some of this trouble, so I wanted to comment on it and also talk about alternatives. So let me say at the outset that I am not, of course, attacking healing and wholeness by any means. I've been in pursuit of both of those, I think, my whole life. And a lot of people have. Well, maybe not my whole life, maybe since college. But they're good things, of course. Whether we're talking about physical healing, psychological healing, what have you, cultural healing, we want those to happen. I'm in pretty good physical condition. I'm pretty healthy. And I like it that if I get sick, I'll probably get better. Except for the last one, right? And some philosophers would argue, well, then you're healing from life, you know? So be that as it may, for now, it's pretty neat that my body will heal itself. And my psyche's pretty decent at that, too. I don't feel like I'm walking around with a bunch of bruises that any breeze can touch and immediately destabilize me. It's not a good way to live. Wholeness often refers to our capacity to be in touch with everything that we are. And so Carl Rogers did both some research and a lot of psychotherapy with people on this very topic. And what he found is that the more in touch, the more conscious we are of the whole range of our feelings and our physical sensorium and everything that makes up human experience, instead of rigidly screening some of it out, then we tend to be healthier, happier, more joyful, more realistic, and a number of other good things. Many of which were characteristics of Maslow's famous self-actualizing people that are exemplars of human potential made real. So those are certainly good things too. So what I want to focus on is the limitation that springs up when we make healing and wholeness too important. When we make them norms instead of goals. And I have a couple of anecdotes to share that I think will focus some light on this. One goes all the way back to when I was right out of college working as a technical writer for an insurance company. And we had these group insurance booklets that had this benefit in them called accidental death and dismemberment. So when you die by certain kinds of accidents, your beneficiaries get money. And they had these diagrams in the books. It was so bizarre. That showed, for instance, how much of your arm had to be severed or how much of your leg or whatever to pay the full benefit. It was kind of macabre when you think about it. And they eventually got rid of all that. But so as a joke, but which in retrospect I think was a wise criticism, one of my coworkers looked at one of these pictures when we were in training and said, well, what if you don't have any legs? Or arms, right? And it got me thinking about how not just ableism, which there's much more awareness of these days than there was way back then, but how often our models for how to be healthy and whole assume this level of functionality that simply isn't possible for some people. And I'm not just talking about physically, I mean psychologically as well. So it's to some extent obvious that, for instance, my elderly mother, who's 89, who's broken both her hips, the goal of being totally physically healthy is meaningless to her. She's never going to be, right? The best that she can do is be comfortable and get around on a walker. That's the best she can do. But I think this applies psychologically too. I think that there are some forms of neglect, abuse, and different kinds of social circumstances, injustices, oppressions that are so severe that they leave a permanent imprint. And that doesn't mean that they can't be healed to some extent, but it does mean that we have to learn to live with them. Fairly recently, there's been some research done on the brains of people who are victims of long-term child abuse. And it looks like those of us who grew up being terrorized in our own homes, and I'm one of those, are subjected to permanent neurological alteration. In other words, the effects stay in our brains forever. Now, healing can make a huge difference here. I've been a therapist to people who were abused as children, and I've also been in my own therapy for the same issues, and it helps a lot. It enables you to move from walking around wounded all the time to actually having a handle on it. And so what used to be open bleeding wounds are scarred over. But the scars are still there. So are the memories. And furthermore, I wouldn't want them to go away. Because exactly where we get most hurt, oftentimes, if we can find a way to live with it, is where our greatest strengths come from as well. My ideal here is a tree, of all things. When a tree sustains a severe injury, it doesn't fully heal ever from that injury. Instead, it secretes layers of sealing. So it seals the wound. And a lot of times when the wound is on the outside, you'll see it for the whole rest of the life of the tree. And the tree may grow to be very old because it carries the wound. It knows how to deal with it. So for the tree, instead of healing, it's sealing. Containing, learning to live with, learning to include what happened into a greater and more spacious story about who you are and where you're going. There's a famous case in the psychoanalytic literature. Anna O was in analysis with Joseph Breuer for a while, and then according to studies in hysteria, which Freud, who knew Breuer, and the doctor published in 1898, I believe it was, they celebrated the success of what was called the cathartic method, the method of healing through talking. And they said, thanks to the brilliant Dr. Breuer, Anna O was cured. So some scholars have looked into this and found out that the picture wasn't so rosy. And when I read their work, I decided to read Dr. Breuer's translated case notes and also do a little bit of digging on my own. So what is often celebrated as the first psychoanalytic case was actually an abysmal failure. Anna O was not only not healed, she was, thanks to Dr. Breuer, inflicted with an addiction to morphine. She was also put in an asylum for a while. Her symptoms were pretty severe even before all that happened. She had depression and anxiety and a number of other things that in the old days were referred to as hysteria and promptly blamed on the women who were patients. And so she did suffer from a lot of psychological symptoms, no question about that. But if anything, the treatment made her worse. What healed her was that she began embracing women's causes. As an activist, as a dramatist, as a highly creative performer. And that seems to have gotten her to the point where she could live with her ailments. She didn't heal so much as seal. It took real courage for her to decide to move forward with the things that mattered to her and to be of assistance to other people in spite of how she was suffering. And to some extent, what she did alleviated that suffering. So, down the road a bit, existential psychology and psychiatry came along to make the point that our decisions in life also can make us healthy or ill. And that we're healthy to the extent that we assume responsibility for our own lives and where we want to take them. This whole piece about responsibility and decision tends to get left out of the conversation about healing and wholeness. In fact, I once quit a Jungian organization because all they wanted to do was leave everything up to the unconscious and be completely directed by dreams. It was an utterly passive outlook, and it didn't work for me. I don't think it worked for them either. When I was working with the courts and with victim advocates years ago, and counseling violent men and doing presentations and teaching and training therapists, I can't tell you how many times I got asked, what is the cause of battery? And I always said the same thing, batterers. The question implies that it's not a choice, and it is one. And sure, there's all kinds of underlying factors. There's deep wounding, and there's all kinds of frustration that gets built up and things like that. But in the end, people choose violence. And when they make different choices, their lives are happier, and then they do some healing. I think Rollo May was quite right when he pointed out that there are some forces of healing that only get released after you make a key decision, not before. Which may or may not involve the talking cure, by the way. And for more about this, you might want to listen to episode 28, the title of which is In Praise of Being Quiet. So at this point, I'll give you a somewhat painful, even now, example of exactly how making wrong decisions can result in all kinds of mayhem that you didn't expect. And that it's not really a matter of being more whole or even healing. And that paradigm actually can keep you from making the decisions that you need to make. So I went through a period of a couple of years of career uncertainty, which I talked to friends and my partner of the time about extensively. And they were supportive and helpful. But I had made a career decision, and it has some effect on other people and organizations, so I'm not going to be specific about what that was. But I made a career decision I shouldn't have made. And after a while, the effects of that started showing up in my dreams, in how people treated me, in my relationship, in physical problems. I was affected by it neurologically to some extent. And I gained a lot of weight and got sick for a while too. So I knew something was happening, but as carefully as I examined it, I couldn't figure out what it was. And partly because I was still stuck in the healing wholeness paradigm of what am I hiding from myself? What am I refusing to admit to myself? What work do I need to do on myself and all that? None of which applied. And so I finally woke up one day and I went, I made a bad decision a couple of years ago. And I haven't got on the right road still. And that's why these things are happening. It works kind of like this. And I don't recall ever hearing about this in healing-oriented therapies. So maybe we need to talk about this more in therapy. But so let's say you're on a road that originally was a good road. And then an exit sign appears. Time to get off, right? Time to go somewhere else. And you don't take the exit. So another exit sign appears and you don't take that one because you're pretty comfortable and you like where the road is going and it's always been a good road. And so what happens next is the gargoyles come out, the creatures, the scary night creatures, and they start coming after you on that road. And it feels to you like something is going wrong here. Why are these people attacking me? Why are these scary people showing up? Why is my relationship a mess and stuff like that? And it's because your good road has now turned bad because you were on it too long. You made the wrong decision. And yes, there are emotional reasons why you made the wrong decision, but in the end, it's not about what you're repressing or keeping down or anything like that. It's that you need to make the right decision and get on a different road, which I did. And all the problems cleared up. That's the nice thing about some bad decisions. You can't always take them back, but sometimes you can. I think sometimes about Sir Percival pursuing the Holy Grail out in the forest somewhere. He sees the Grail castle, he has the Grail within his grasp, and he blows it. He doesn't ask the right questions, and he gets booted out of the castle, and then he's got to search for more years. And so finally, at one point, he comes across another knight, and he says, I saw the Grail and I failed. And the other knight, who's dying, gives him really good advice. Try again. And sometimes you can. And then you get it right, and the healing follows. Not precedes, follows. Sometimes our decisions make us. Not how much we know, not how psychologically aware we are, not how whole we are or integrated, but what we decide to do with what we have. The philosopher Nietzsche talked about what he called higher wholeness, or at least that's how it's translated from the German. And as an example, he said, the person who's blind in one eye sees better out of the other. If we learn to live with our gaps, imperfections, and weaknesses, we cultivate a different kind of strength, a different kind of vitality. And since realizing that, I've also realized that, at least for me, vitality trumps wholeness. It's not about how whole you are as a norm. It's about what you do with what you have that makes a difference. And not just in psychology, but for centuries, even millennia, in circles that are spiritual, religious, or philosophical, you often hear about these supreme beings, these humans who turned into spirits, and these enlightened gurus and enlightened teachers and people like that, people who are supposedly perfect. And I've heard them described so many times in idealizing tones. And what I always wonder is, but what are you doing with what you have now? Are you wasting time comparing yourself to these people, or trying to advance in their direction, or are you making use of what you were given? In my counseling days, I worked with men who were barely functional, who I prized above the more psychologically aware clients I had, because those men worked hard. They would do anything to get better. They had very few tools. Some of them were homeless, but they would not give up on themselves. And I'll work for anybody who's like that. Going places for them wasn't a matter of just being more healed, more whole, more enlightened. It was life or death. I think, too, in this connection of the old Hasidic legend of the Lamed Vavniks, the 36, the people who among us who are down and outs, usually considered losers, they're usually poor, don't have all of their mental faculties, but the 36 are special because their suffering, according to this old story, holds the entire universe in balance. So in heaven, they're referred to as the people of perfect equilibrium. Kind of turns our customary notions of health, healing, and wholeness on their heads. After Beethoven went deaf, there probably wasn't a minute of his life that went by in which he would have traded anything to get his hearing back. Instead, he kept composing. And now we have the Ninth Symphony. Thank you.